It's Monday the 6th of April. There's a nice cool breeze in the air, but it's not as cold as it used to be a couple of months ago when we were still in the winter season. Which is good news for me, because it means, especially with the sun in the sky for longer, I no longer need to worry about it being cold and dark. I can make more evening or late afternoon video logs. And I've always been a nocturnal kind of person. I prefer doing things in the late afternoon or early evening. I've always been that way, so I can make more of these video logs. Anyway, in this video I wanted to address something that a post I made on my wall a couple of weeks ago when my grandma was in the hospital. It was me debating whether or not I should share with you that I had this idea for a novel that I might want to write someday. I say might because I'm notorious for being non-committal on these kinds of issues. You know, one day I have this really strong idea for some creative project. So I've got something in my eye. Anyway, I'll have these days where one day I have this really strong, zealous idea that I want to pursue for a creative project or enterprise, and then weeks later suddenly my motivational energy reserves completely dry out and I'm left thinking that it was a stupid waste of my time and energy. It's happened many times before. The difference is now, because I've shared this with all of you guys watching this, I can hear your feedback and I can be either positively encouraged or given constructive feedback on how I should proceed at this point. So, why do I want to write a novel? Well, why does anyone want to write a novel? I guess it's a mixture of A, wanting to tell a story, B, wanting to impart some of the truths or tidbits of experience that I've picked up based on my formative years of growing up and living and how I see the world, seeing if anybody who reads it might register or connect with it in any meaningful way. 3, give myself a challenge. See if I can do something that will inspire me to get out of bed and work harder, as it were. Well, again, as I say, why does anyone want to do anything? Why does anyone want to write a novel? I don't really think of myself as a writer, but I might as well give it a try. If the worst thing happens, I might just procrastinate and end the project halfway or midway through, as usually happens. But you know what they say, the journey with 1,000 miles begins with a single step. I might as well take that single step. You guys can let me know what you think. So, I had the idea for this story for many years. I think the sort of the genesis for this concept, for the story, has been around, I think, since in my mid-20s, when I was working this depressing job as a bartender for this local inn and restaurant and bar, where I was really hating my life and my work, and then it started as a daydream, basically. You know, I think a lot of stories are like that, actually. A lot of fully fledged stories with their own lore, probably all of them originate based on a whim, a fantasy, a what if this happened scenario. So, anyway, what's the novel going to be about? Well, here's basically the outline for my story. It doesn't have a title so far. Well, the working title I have for it, it's probably going to change. The working title is going to be The Machine Man. I'll probably think of a better one later. Anyway, here's the essence of what happens. So, the story is about a young man who works a job, a dead-end job, that he hates. He hates himself, he hates his life. He feels like nobody around ever respects him or appreciates him. He feels like he doesn't have any talent, any skills, anything that he can use to lift himself out of his misery and prove himself to the world that he exists and his existence matters. And he feels like he's stuck in this dead-end job for the rest of his life. Until one day, something happens that changes his life forever. This young man's life is thrown upside down. something extraordinary happens to him. And I haven't quite figured out how that is yet, but anyway, he experiences this life-changing freak accident at this place of work. I haven't worked out how this will happen, but somehow he experiences a traumatic brain injury that almost kills him. There could be a number of ways that this happens. I haven't decided. Either he's busy cleaning some kind of coffee machine that's faulty, and then the coffee machine explodes and a piece of metal goes straight through his brain, or he's driving home from work and he ends up in a near fatal car crash and a piece of metal goes through his brain. It's important that something goes through his brain for reasons that I'm about to explain later. Or a criminal storms into his place of work, if he works at a gas station, again, this is all just the blueprint, and demands that he hand over the money, and then by accident the criminal fires a shot that goes straight through his parietal lobe and again damages his brain. Anyway, the how and the why is not that important. What's important more is the what. So anyway, he suffers a nearly fatal brain injury and he's admitted to hospital. And he is barely brought back from the brink of death. He survives a medically induced coma. He undergoes physical rehabilitation. Eventually he's discharged back from the hospital. However, he's not the same person that he was before. Because, you see, the life-threatening, the death-defying incident that occurred, that happened to him, that barely almost killed him, it affects his brain in such a very specific way. It targets a very specific region of the brain, and it ends up changing his personality. So before the life-threatening incident, he was sort of passive, quite pessimistic, self-loathing, but polite and well-meaning. I created this guy basically sort of to, because I can identify with him on some level, but I don't want to go so far as to say he's a self-insert. Anyway, he's like any guy you'd ever meet who has a dead-end job in this day and age. However, after the incident, he changes. He becomes a lot different. He becomes more cold. He becomes more calculating. He becomes more psychopathic and aggressive. He starts committing crimes. He starts disrespecting authority. He starts sexually harassing random women. And more than anything, though, he becomes a lot more productive and more concerned with things like wealth and status. And he has this insatiable drive and appetite to push himself. And another thing, he feels no fear anymore. He doesn't fear getting into dangerous situations anymore. So he changes in a way that makes him totally unrecognizable. And in a nutshell, that's essentially the plot of the story. It's about a before and after of an ordinary gas station worker who suffers a near fatal brain injury through some bizarre plot contrivance, which I haven't settled on yet, and he returns back to work, but he becomes a totally different person. And the story is meant to chronicle and tell the story of how he's changed. And more to the point, the central core theme that I want to explore in the story is that he has changed, although in a lot of ways he's become dangerous, aggressive and psychotic and a criminal and not someone you'd want to be in the same room with. He becomes a lot more happy. He becomes a lot more content with his life, even though he's a danger to society, even though he starts treating random people like tools to be used, even though he no longer feels any sense of empathy or moral reciprocity. He becomes so, whereas before he had little to no self-esteem, this time he's aggressively overconfident and cocky, like he thinks he is above the law and the rules, and he becomes a dyed-in-the-wool sort of criminal, that kind of thing. And his life just sort of goes in an entirely different direction. I haven't really settled on how the story ends. And even at this stage, I'm not even sure exactly what kind of story it is that I want to tell, because at this point, the story could go off in any number of different directions. I mean, here's a couple of ending ways I thought the story could eventually end. One way is that he gets revenge on all the people, all the shitty people who looked down upon him before. Like, he kills them, he humiliates them, or he violently beats them near to death. Well, he screws them over in some way, whereas he would not have had the moral compunction or the nerve to do so beforehand. And I think a lot of people would like to read that kind of story, because no matter how shitty the main character of any story is, as a rule, we always root for them, right? Anyone who's seen all the episodes of Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul, objectively speaking, you know, Walter White and Saul Goodman, they're both really shitty people. They make a lot of terrible decisions. They had a lot of opportunities to redeem themselves, but they passed them by because of their ego, or because life forced their hand in some way. But no matter what happens, we always want to see them come out on top, or we want to see them justify themselves to us. That may just be a specific feature of Vince Gilligan or whatever, but the point is, you know, that's a kind of story, that's one way that this story could go. But anyway, the one unchanging idea or theme of the story is that even though the bullets, whatever it is, even though the incident has completely transformed his life beyond any sense of recognition, in an ironic kind of way, he feels like a better, happier, and wiser person for it. Like he's always wanted to transform, to undergo a sort of spiritual metamorphosis that would change him into a different person, that would be more grateful for his lot in life and, you know, more able to, you know, seize the day, to carpe diem. And in an unusual turn of events, life afforded him that transformation that he so desperately craved. And by the end of the story, even though he's racked up all kinds of crimes on his right, even though he's done all manner of terrible things, even though he is objectively a shittier person, even though he's cruel and sadistic, he is wiser and happier, and he doesn't regret anything he's ever done. So basically, yeah, that's the idea for the story that I want to write. And the funny thing is, I got the original idea for this story. It was all based on a daydream that I had once, years back when I was at work. When I was working this job, it was a very depressing time in my life. It was shortly after the end of the pandemic. I was a bartender. I wasn't making a lot of cash. I was hating myself, hating my life. My relationship was just on the brink of ending. I still haven't discussed that, but I'll talk about that some other time. And I was just daydreaming. Wouldn't it be great if something happened to me that completely changed me into a different person? Like I experienced some horrific TBI that changed me so that I felt nothing. And believe it or not, there's a very well-known case study of a man who experienced something just like this. And you guys probably know all about him, because just searching his name on Google or on YouTube, you'll find loads of people talking about him. So there was an American railway construction worker called Phineas Gage. He was a guy who lived in the 19th century, back when America was expanding westward and they were building railways and towns and settlements. And by all accounts, he was a hard-working, reliable, good-natured young guy who liked working hard. And then one day, while he was trying to use dynamite to blow a hole in these rocks so that he could build more railway tracks, a freak accident occurred. Basically, what happened was he put the tamping iron inside a hole in the rocks where he'd also put dynamite, and he forgot to wet the dynamite. So the tamping iron caused a chain reaction where there was a mini explosion, and what happened was the tamping iron went straight through his head and it pierced through his brain. And specifically, it went through a region of his brain called the prefrontal cortex. And the crazy thing about the whole story is he survived. He was discharged from the doctor who treated him in a fairly short time, but he became an entirely different person. He became rude, he became vulgar, he was disrespectful to other people around him. I forget the exact words that the doctor who worked on him said, but basically he could not go back to his old place of work because he was a completely changed man, and nobody wanted to be around him anymore. But the story doesn't quite end there, because it's also said that many years later in his life, he'd somehow managed to turn himself around, and he became a stagecoach operator in a foreign country where he had to speak an entirely different language. And the evidence seems to suggest that somehow whatever had happened to him in that one initial incident, it wasn't completely the end of the world for him. Like, he had even despite the overwhelming odds, even though he'd almost gotten killed, his brain had literally been punctured with a big metal rod. And you can see a picture of him standing next to that metal rod that went through his brain, because this guy went around. He was sort of a national icon. He would appear in freak shows or in circus carnivals and stuff like that. Despite all the things that happened to him, though, he managed to get his life back on track. So anyway, that was where I think that's where the seed for the story sort of originated. The idea that you can change and become an entirely different person through no fault of your own, through no actions of your own, if your brain is affected in a very specific way. And that led me down a whole rabbit hole of lots of other people whose lives have similarly or dissimilarly been impacted, not always for the better, I think in most cases for the worse, by something that happened. And there's so many examples of this. I mean, there's another example, again, from America, is this guy called Charles Whitman, who you probably know as the Texas Tower Sniper. And who was Charles Whitman? Well, he was a 20-something-year-old Marine who, throughout his life, he just wanted to do right by his family and his community. He'd never done anything wrong, and he was, for the most part, he was a straight guy who was, completely out of the ordinary. Until one day he started having these violent, irrational thoughts, and he couldn't understand why. He kept having these urges where he wanted to kill people. He kept having fantasies where he'd look up at the church tower at Texas University, and he was thinking, I could kill lots of people if I went up there. And he kept speaking to the psychiatrist who evaluated him, and he kept complaining of these headaches, these murderous instincts he'd had, but nothing happened. And then eventually one morning, he strangled his wife and his mother to death, and he wrote a letter of apology next to their dead bodies, explaining that he couldn't understand why he did this. He regretted it, but he still did it anyway. And then he went all the way to the top of the Texas Tower, and he started picking off random targets with a rifle, shooting people to death. And I can't remember how many people died. I think it was at least a dozen, maybe more. And the curious thing is, he left behind a note saying, I want my brain to be examined because I don't understand why I've done this. So they did that, and what they found was really interesting. They found that there was a pecan-sized tumor inside his brain near a region of the brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala is a very strange region of the brain because it's associated with a number of things. It's associated with fear and aggression. And I think it might also be associated with empathy or morality or that could be, or it could be the prefrontal cortex. I'm not entirely sure, but basically the technology, you know, to do things like neuroimaging didn't really exist back in the 1960s when this crime occurred. But what people seem to think was the case is that he was driven to do his actions, he was driven to his crimes because he had a tumor growing in his brain. That would, for one, that would have explained all the headaches that he kept complaining of. And if the thinking is correct, it may have explained why he did all his terrible things, because he had no clue why he did it. He even as he strangled his wife and mother to death, he didn't understand why he had to do it, but he just did it anyway. Yeah, it's a really tragic case. But anyway, and there's so many other stories like that. But over time, sort of the genesis for this story's taken shape in my head as a series of daydreams, and it's now gotten to the point where I figure, well, I'm not getting any younger. It's not like I'm getting any busier either, because I have hardly any hours at work. So why not give this a try? Anyway, that's the idea I have for my story. I think what I'm probably going to do is I'm going to write a sort of preliminary draft, a first draft for a first chapter. And I want you guys maybe to take a look at it and let me know what your thoughts are. See, I haven't really written anything in ages. I mean, I used to write short stories a decade ago, but I haven't had a lot of practice as a writer. And writing is a craft, it's a skill, it's a thing that you're supposed to keep practicing at. And the more you practice, the better you get. And the only way I'll know if my writing's any good is if I hear back from people and hear what their thoughts are about it. But anyway, yeah, I'll probably produce the first draft sometime later, and if you guys are interested, you can let me know what your thoughts are. Anyway, I'll see you guys later. That's just a little update. This is me tracking. Take care, everyone.